The humid night air of Washington, District of Columbia, hung heavy on June 17, 1972. As a solitary security guard, named Frank Wills began his routine rounds at the Watergate complex. It was a sprawling collection of office buildings and luxury apartments that overlooked the Potomac River and served as a symbol of power and prestige in the capital city. Wills noticed something odd on a basement door lock, where a piece of tape had been placed horizontally over the latch bolt to keep the door from locking. He assumed the cleaning crew had left it and peeled it off without thinking much of it at the time. When he returned later and found the tape replaced on the exact same lock, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. This was no accident or oversight by a janitor. Someone was inside the building, and they did not want to be trapped. Wills called the police and unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that would eventually destroy a presidency. The responding officers arrived in an unmarked car and dressed in casual clothes, which allowed them to approach the building without alerting the intruders inside. They entered the Democratic National Committee headquarters on the 6th floor with guns drawn and senses heightened. Inside the darkened offices, they found 5 men huddled behind desks and wearing surgical gloves while attempting to photograph documents and adjust listening devices. The men were Virgil Gonzalez and Bernard Barker and James McCord and Eugenio Martinez and Frank Sturgis. They were not common thieves looking for petty cash or valuables. They were dressed in business suits and carried thousands of dollars in crisp, sequential $100 bills. They had sophisticated electronic surveillance equipment and lock picks. The arrest was quiet, but the implications were deafening. These men were professionals, and they were operating in the heart of the opposition party headquarters during an election year. At the police station, the 5 burglars refused to answer questions about their motives or their employers, but their connections began to surface almost immediately. One of the men, named James McCord, whispered to the judge during his arraignment that he had recently retired from the Central Intelligence Agency. This revelation sent a shockwave through the courtroom and alerted the few reporters present that this was not a simple burglary. Among the possessions seized from the men were address books containing the name E. Howard Hunt, followed by the notation W. House or White House. The connection to the seat of executive power was tenuous at first, but it was a thread that investigators would pull until the entire fabric of the administration began to unravel. The White House press secretary, Ron Ziegler, dismissed the incident as a third-rate burglary and tried to distance the president from the crime. 2 young reporters at the Washington Post, named Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, were not satisfied with the official narrative coming from the White House. They began to dig into the background of the burglars and found a labyrinth of connections leading to the Committee for the Re-election of the President, which was often abbreviated as CREEP. They discovered that a $25,000 check intended for the campaign had ended up in the bank account of one of the burglars. This was the first concrete evidence linking the break-in to the campaign funds of President Richard Nixon. The deeper they dug, the more resistance they encountered. Witnesses were scared to talk, and officials issued non-denial denials that obfuscated the truth. The atmosphere in Washington became thick with paranoia as people realized they were being watched and recorded. To navigate this dangerous landscape, Bob Woodward relied on a secret source he referred to as Deep Throat. They would meet in the dead of night within the shadowed concrete depths of an underground parking garage in Rosslyn, Virginia. Deep Throat was a high-ranking official in the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Named Mark felt though his identity would remain a secret for decades. He provided crucial guidance and confirmed information that the reporters had gathered from other sources. He famously advised Woodward to follow the money. This advice became the compass for the investigation and led the reporters to uncover a massive slush fund used to finance intelligence gathering operations against the political enemies of the administration. The scale of the corruption was far greater than a single break-in at the Watergate. Despite the growing scandal and the persistent reporting by the Washington Post, President Richard Nixon won the 1972 election in a landslide victory. The American public was largely unaware of the depth of the criminality, or they simply did not believe that the president could be involved in such a scheme. The administration had successfully contained the story for the moment, but the legal process was grinding forward. The trial of the 5 burglars and their 2 handlers, E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy, began in January 1973. The judge was John Sirica, who was known as Maximum John for his harsh sentencing. Sirica was not convinced that the burglars were acting alone, and he pressured them to reveal who had ordered the operation. He threatened them with lengthy prison sentences if they did not cooperate with the investigation. The pressure exerted by Judge Sirica finally caused a crack in the wall of silence. James McCord wrote a letter to the judge just days before his sentencing, in which he admitted that he had committed perjury during the trial. He stated that the defendants had been under political pressure to plead guilty and remain silent. He also revealed that high-ranking officials in the administration were involved. This letter blew the lid off the cover-up and transformed the Watergate affair from a localized crime into a national crisis. The Senate voted to establish a select committee to investigate the campaign activities, and the hearings began in May 1973. The hearings were televised, and millions of Americans tuned in daily to watch the drama unfold. The Senate Watergate Committee was chaired by Senator Sam Ervin, who was a Democrat from North Carolina with a folksy demeanor and a sharp legal mind. He became an unlikely folk hero, as he presided over the hearings with a copy of the Constitution in his pocket. The committee called a parade of witnesses, including former administration officials, who began to turn on one another. The most damaging testimony came from John Dean, who had served as the White House counsel. Dean testified with a monotone voice and a precise memory as he detailed the extent of the cover-up. He told the committee that he had warned the president that there was a cancer growing on the presidency. He directly implicated Richard Nixon in the obstruction of justice. The testimony of John Dean was explosive, but it was essentially his word against the word of the president. The White House vehemently denied the accusations and attacked the credibility of Dean. The investigation seemed to be reaching a stalemate until a surprise witness named Alexander Butterfield appeared before the committee. Butterfield was a former presidential aide who was asked a routine question about White House record keeping. He reluctantly revealed that President Nixon had installed a voice-activated taping system in the Oval Office and other key locations. This system had recorded almost every conversation the president had held since 1971. The realization stunned the committee and the nation. The truth about Watergate was not lost to history, but was preserved on magnetic tape. The existence of the tapes changed everything. The investigation now had a clear objective, which was to obtain the recordings and determine what the president knew and when he knew it. The special prosecutor Archibald Cox, who had been appointed to lead the criminal investigation, issued a subpoena for the tapes. President Nixon refused to comply and cited executive privilege. He argued that the president had a right to keep his communications private to protect national security. This legal battle set up a constitutional confrontation between the executive branch and the judicial branch. The country watched with bated breath as the president defied the legal orders of the courts. The conflict came to a head on Saturday, October 20th, 1973, in an event that became known as the Saturday Night Massacre. President Nixon ordered his Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox. Richardson refused to carry out the order and resigned in protest. The president then ordered the Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus to fire Cox. Ruckelshaus also refused and resigned. Finally, the Solicitor General Robert Bork carried out the order and fired Cox. The public reaction was immediate and furious. Telegrams poured into Washington, demanding the impeachment of the president. The firing of the prosecutor was seen as a blatant admission of guilt and a gross abuse of power. The Saturday Night Massacre severely damaged the standing of Richard Nixon, but he remained defiant. He held a televised press conference where he famously declared that he was not a crook. However, the legal walls were closing in. The Supreme Court eventually ruled unanimously that the president had to turn over the tapes to the new special prosecutor Leon Jaworski. When the tapes were finally released, they contained a shocking revelation. There was an 18.5-minute gap in a crucial conversation between Nixon and his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, which took place 3 days after the break-in. The White House claimed the gap was an accidental erasure by Secretary Rose Mary Woods, but experts determined it was done deliberately. The investigation moved into its final phase as the House Judiciary Committee began impeachment proceedings against the president. They drafted 3 articles of impeachment, which charged Richard Nixon with obstruction of justice and abuse of power and contempt of Congress. The evidence on the tapes was damning. One specific recording from June 23, 1972, became known as the smoking gun tape. It captured Nixon ordering his staff to have the Central Intelligence Agency block the Federal Bureau of Investigation inquiry into the break-in. This was definitive proof that the president had participated in the cover-up from the very beginning. His political support in Congress evaporated overnight. On August 7, 1974, a delegation of senior Republican leaders, including Senator Barry Goldwater, went to the White House. They told the president that he had lost the support of his own party and that he would be impeached by the House and convicted by the Senate. They advised him that his only option was to resign. Richard Nixon realized that the end had come. He spent the night in the Lincoln sitting room, contemplating his legacy and the disgrace that had befallen him. The man who had won one of the largest landslides in American history was now isolated and defeated by his own actions. On the evening of August 8, 1974, President Richard Nixon addressed the nation from the Oval Office. He announced that he would resign the presidency effective at noon the following day. He spoke of the need for the country to heal and move forward, but he offered no clear admission of guilt. The next morning, he gave an emotional farewell speech to his staff in the East Room of the White House. He famously told them that others may hate you, but those who hate you do not win unless you hate them, and then you destroy yourself. He then walked out to the South Lawn and boarded the presidential helicopter known as Army One. As the helicopter prepared to lift off, Richard Nixon stood in the doorway and flashed his signature double V for victory sign with a forced smile on his face. It was a surreal image of a man trying to project strength in the moment of his ultimate defeat. The helicopter rose into the air and carried the first president in United States history to resign from office away from the seat of power. Vice President Gerald Ford was sworn in as the 38th president shortly after. He declared that our long national nightmare is over. The transition of power was peaceful, but the nation was left traumatized and cynical. 1 month later, President Gerald Ford made a controversial decision that would define his own presidency. He granted a full and unconditional pardon to Richard Nixon for any crimes he might have committed against the United States while in office. Ford believed that a long public trial of the former president would only further divide the country and prevent healing. The public reaction was hostile, and many believed a corrupt deal had been made. The pardon likely cost Gerald Ford the election in 1976, but history has looked more kindly on his decision as an act of mercy that allowed the nation to move on. While Richard Nixon avoided prison, many of his top aides did not. John Mitchell, who was the former Attorney General, and H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman were all convicted of conspiracy and obstruction of justice and perjury. They served time in federal prison. The Watergate scandal resulted in 69 government officials being charged and 48 being found guilty. It was a purge of the political establishment that revealed how deeply the corruption had penetrated the highest levels of government. The image of powerful men in suits being led away in handcuffs became a defining visual of the era. The legacy of the Watergate scandal fundamentally changed American politics and society. It destroyed the blind trust that many citizens had placed in their government. Before Watergate, the presidency was often viewed with a sense of reverence and infallibility. After Watergate, the public assumed that politicians were capable of lying and breaking the law. It ushered in an era of cynicism and skepticism that persists to this day. The suffix "gate" became attached to every subsequent scandal and served as a permanent reminder of the break in that toppled a president. Journalism also entered a new golden age following the scandal. Bob Woodward and Bernstein became celebrities and inspired a generation of young people to become investigative reporters. The press became more aggressive in holding power accountable, and the relationship between the media and the government became more adversarial. The role of the Fourth Estate as a check on tyranny was reaffirmed. The Washington Post won a Pulitzer Prize for its coverage, and the story was immortalized in the book and film All the President's Men. Congress responded to the abuses of power exposed by Watergate by passing a series of laws designed to prevent such corruption from happening again. The Ethics in Government Act established financial disclosure requirements for public officials and created the mechanism for appointing independent counsels. The Freedom of Information Act was strengthened to provide greater transparency. The War Powers Resolution was passed to limit the ability of the president to commit troops without congressional approval. These reforms were an attempt to restore the balance of power and ensure that no president could ever again act above the law. The mystery of Deep Throat remained one of the greatest secrets in American history for more than 30 years. Speculation ran rampant, with everyone from Henry Kissinger to lower-level aides being named as potential candidates. It was not until 2005 that Mark Felt revealed himself as the source. He was 91 years old and suffering from dementia, but he wanted to claim his place in history before he died. His family confirmed his role, and Bob Woodward verified the claim. Felt had been the number 2 man at the Federal Bureau of Investigation and had leaked the information because he was angry at the Nixon administration for interfering with the Bureau and passing him over for promotion. The Watergate complex itself remains a fixture of the Washington skyline. It stands as a physical monument to the scandal. The office where the burglars were caught has been renovated many times, but the history is embedded in the walls. Tourists still visit the site to see where the course of history was changed by a piece of tape on a door latch. It serves as a reminder that even the most powerful institutions are vulnerable to the hubris of the men who lead them. The break-in was a clumsy failure, but the cover-up was a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. Richard Nixon spent his post-presidency trying to rehabilitate his image, He wrote memoirs and books on foreign policy and traveled the world as an elder statesman. He gave a series of famous interviews to British journalist David Frost in 1977, where he apologized to the American people for letting them down, but still insisted he had not committed a crime. He died in 1994 and was buried at his presidential library in Yorba Linda, California. His funeral was attended by 5 presidents who paid their respects to the man while acknowledging the complexity of his legacy. The psychological impact of the scandal on the American psyche cannot be overstated. It occurred against the backdrop of the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement and the cultural upheavals of the 1960s and 1970s. It was the final straw that broke the consensus of the post-World War II era. It fueled the rise of conspiracy theories and a deep-seated suspicion of authority. The question of who watches the watchman became a central theme in American culture. Watergate proved that the system could work and that the law could pursue even the highest official, but it also proved that the system was fragile. Historians continue to debate the motivations behind the break-in. Some believe the burglars were looking for information on a prostitution ring that could compromise the Democrats. Others believe they were looking for evidence that the Democrats were receiving funding from foreign governments. There are theories that the operation was sabotaged from within by the Central Intelligence Agency to weaken Nixon. The full truth may never be known, as many of the key players have taken their secrets to the grave. The silence of the tapes during those 18.5 minutes remains the ultimate symbol of the unknown. The lessons of Watergate are timeless. They speak to the corrupting nature of power and the importance of integrity in public service. They remind us that the cover-up is often worse than the crime. The scandal demonstrated that a free press and an independent judiciary are essential safeguards of democracy. It showed that the Constitution is not just a piece of paper, but a living framework that can withstand the greatest tests. The system bent under the weight of the corruption, but it did not break. Today, the Watergate scandal is taught in schools as a cautionary tale. It is a benchmark against which all other political scandals are measured. When a politician is accused of wrongdoing, the comparison to Nixon is inevitable. The ghost of Watergate haunts the halls of power in Washington, serving as a silent warning to those who would abuse their office. It is a story of human flaws and institutional strength. It is a story that began in the dark with a flashlight beam cutting through the gloom and ended in the bright light of public scrutiny. As we look back on the events of 1972 through 1974, we are left with a profound sense of how close the United States came to a constitutional crisis that could have shattered the republic. The resilience of the institutions and the courage of individuals like Frank Wills and Judge Sirica and the relentless reporters saved the day. The break-in that toppled a president was a turning point in history. It was the moment when America lost its innocence, but gained a harder and more realistic understanding of its own democracy. The final question that lingers is whether we have truly learned the lessons of Watergate. In an age of polarized politics and misinformation, the truth is often harder to find than it was in the days of Woodward and Bernstein. The need for vigilance is greater than ever. The tape on the door latch was a small thing, but it revealed a rot that had spread deep into the foundation of the state. We must always be watching for the next piece of tape and the next attempt to lock out the truth. The price of liberty is eternal vigilance, and Watergate is the ultimate proof of that maxim.